Great.
Thanks very much, Karin. Thanks for not just being here, but staying here. I think it's been a fantastic day. I'd like to start, first of all, by congratulating the Centre on its 10th anniversary. On behalf of the Stockholm Environment Institute, on behalf also of the Nordic Centre of Excellence of Strategic Adaptation Research, which I'm co-directing, and where CSPR also plays an important role. I'd also like to thank Frank and Steve for setting the scene so effectively with excellent presentations. Just one extra word of thanks to Steve also for drawing attention to Roger Pilke Jr. and for standing up to the censorship and vilification that has stopped him from taking part in this meeting. I think it's a very sad situation where scholarship is being suppressed simply because it doesn't fit a particular political agenda. And that, to some extent, is also what we're going to talk about here, because we're going to talk about scholarship, about the new scholarship towards towards governance of climate change. We've got four excellent panelists here. I'll just introduce them very briefly, alphabetically. We have the second of left, Michelle Betzel, who's Professor of Political Science in Colorado State University. She's on sabbatical working as a guest researcher with the Center for Environment and Climate Research and Political Science Department at Lund University. For the past 15 years, her research is focused on the governance of global climate change from a global to local level across public and private spheres, with a particular emphasis on governance beyond the multilateral regime. Then on the right, we have, on Michelle's left, second of the right, we have Arti Gupta, who is an associate professor at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, with a PhD from Yale University. Her research interests include the role of science, knowledge and transparency in global environmental governance, with a focus on agriculture, biotechnology, forests, and most recently, climate. She's got a book forthcoming with MIT Press on transparency in global environmental governance, critical perspectives, edited together with Michael Mason. Then on the right, we have Chuks Okereke. He's an associate professor in environment and development at the School of Archaeology, Geography and Environmental Science at the University of Reading. His area of interest is broadly the governance of climate change and links with international development. He was also a lead author on the IPCC Working Group 3 Fifth Assessment Report chapter on sustainable development and equity. And then on the left, we have John Vogler, who is currently a professorial research fellow in international relations at Keele University in the UK. He's written books on the global commons and on the EU as a global actor. For 20 years, John was convener of the British International Studies Association Environment Group, and he's currently a member of the UK ESRC Centre for Climate Change, Economics and Policy. And he was also Chuck's PhD advisor. So I would like to start with Michelle. I haven't got the program here. I do have the program here. The title of this session is New Directions in Climate Governance Scholarship. So, question to all four of you: what direction do you think the scholarship is going? Why is it going there, and what's new about it?
All right, thank you. So I'm going to speak from the perspective of someone who is very clearly situated in what Frank would call the transnationalist camp. And I didn't coordinate this, but I had already written my comments, and they respond directly to some of the things you said need to happen, because I think they are happening. I think one of the things those of us who work in that area have been accused of is sort of collecting curiosities, as my colleague Harriet Bulkley says, that we find interesting things going on in the city, or interesting partnerships, or little climate experiments, and we sort of write articles about them and say, aren't these interesting? And then we put them on the shelf and we can look at them, but really, are they worth anything? Do they matter? And I think as a community, we're starting to take that seriously and say, well, we do have to ask this question. And I think what we're realizing is that it's not a straightforward matter to say, do they matter? How do we think about their effectiveness? And that it really isn't particularly helpful to try to calculate, the impact on reducing emissions of any given one of these activities in large measure, because often that's not why these activities are set up in the first place. And so trying to think about, this as a system of bottom-up initiatives of, this elephant that we have, what sort of effect or impact is it having in how we think about the climate problem and moving forward to governing the climate issue? And in particular, thinking about how they put us on a transformative pathway. And so how can, through activities at the local level, through things like the Carbon Disclosure Project, things in the private sector, are they realigning political coalitions? Are they allowing for the creation of new visions of a future? And in what ways do they perhaps reorient the political context in which the multilateral treaty negotiations take place? So thinking about it as a place where we can sort of shift the balance of the debate in new ways and create a new politics of climate change. I think another direction that a lot of us are taking the research thinking about is sort of operating in that middle space between multilateralism and transnationalism, and sort of moving away from this idea, if we just let all of these things blossom, the world will be good, and recognizing that, even if that's if that were possible, that may take too long, and that we might need to think about all of this as a system, and how can we sort of tweak the system to make one part facilitate the other. And so what are the mutual interactions between the multilateral treaty regime and this sort of world of transnational or subnational climate governance? What can be, and thinking what can best be done through the treaty. There's competitive advantage to doing certain things at the multilateral level, setting big goals, creating infrastructure like Sebastian was talking about. But we also might, what would happen if we were to ask, what can the treaty do for the transnational climate governance system? So in what ways could the treaty serve that system by providing resources, by creating new partnerships? So rather than thinking about the treaty as sort of at the core of the governance system, thinking about it as something that could serve the broader governance system in new ways and create new ways of governing climate change.
Excellent, thanks. You can pass on the microphone to Artie.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. You can hear me? Yes. And thanks for this invitation to participate in this panel. I think in considering directions that climate scholarship is taking, a first very general point I'd like to make is that given that the very conceptualization of the climate problem is becoming ever more all-encompassing, in that sense, one could argue that climate scholarship and also climate governance scholarship is in one sense moving in all directions. So if we think about, it's not just about energy and transport, etc. If we talk about climate smart agriculture, climate compatible development, climate proofing growth, etc. So then one could claim that, well, more and more people are becoming climate governance scholars. And so the days when one could say, hey, I didn't know you worked on climate are actually over. And I see myself as embodying this trend because I've come to this field relatively recently from working on a bunch of other areas. And of course, then the question that arises is, well, what are the implications of this? And I think, just to mention very briefly, two implications, which we could, of course, discuss in greater detail later. One is, of course, that multiple research communities are now involved and looking at sort of a set of phenomena from very different disciplinary perspectives. And so the field of climate governance is becoming more multidisciplinary, if not yet more interdisciplinary. And what the challenges and opportunities that presents, that's one thing to discuss. But as well, I think another implication is that the same set of phenomena are being looked at from very different worldviews and very different disciplinary perspectives. And so that results in terminology that's used in very different ways, like crucial terminology, which is understood and used in different ways. And I think we saw that also yesterday. So concepts like resilience, or the areas where I work, transparency and accountability, these terms and their meanings and their importance are understood in very different ways. So what are the implications of this for scholarship, and how should we address it? We should become more reflective about the use of our terms and how they're being used, etc. So that's one point I wanted to make. I wanted to make a very quick second point, if I still have time, and that is, if I look at just my own field of climate scholarship, which is basically the global environmental governance research community, political science IR, where I'm coming from, and if I could hang my issue on the Christmas tree of climate scholarship, then I think that actually we've talked a lot about architectures and agents of climate governance in scholarship. So it's all about fragmentation, orchestration, complexity, multilateralism, transnationalism, different actors, etc. But I would claim, and I think this was mentioned a bit by Frank as well, that it's really accountability and allocation, and this is to put adaptation for a minute aside. We'll come back to that, I'm sure, since Richard is chairing. But the crucial questions, and I would even claim that the crucial questions about architecture and agency are actually related to allocation, which was addressed by Frank, will be addressed later. So I wanted to just focus on accountability. I think accountability is being mainstreamed, at least in climate governance, but not yet in climate scholarship, and I think that's an important point. And what I mean by, do I have to stop, Richard? Can I?
Finish your sentence.
Oh, I can finish my sentence, okay. So I hope I'll have the opportunity to explain what I mean by accountability is being mainstreamed. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Chucks.
As a consequence of climate change moving in so many different directions, what you then see is that climate change governance scholarship has become far less grandiose, far less visionary, far less imaginary, far less idealistic, and a lot more, micro, fragmented, and tamed, and in certain respect, I would say, quite timid. So if you go to 1992, 1994, up to 1997, and you look at the literature on climate governance, you see big terms like sustainable development, climate change, and liberalism, the end of liberalism, global democracy. You see our own Robin here talking about green state. Big concepts. Since we came into this room this morning, I think it was in passing that Frank actually used the word capitalism. And so this idea that there are different worldviews within which we can engage in this problem is almost completely jettisoned. The space has become so constrained, and we are now all trying to operate within a particular narrow neoliberal worldview which constrains the imagination and space. You can clearly see this if you look at the issue of justice. So at the beginning, you have grand concepts like contraction and convergence, common but differential responsibility principle, planetary boundaries, and all of these other big concepts. The notion that climate change warrants an opportunity, if you like, to construct a new world order was palpable, was visible for the taking in the 1990s, 1994s, but now that has almost all but disappeared, leading to this fragmentation, and some people actually wear that with some sophistication. You asked us to say why. I've already alluded to this smaller space as we've all been recruited, because as Frank was saying, and also Steve, if you don't play by the rule, you get vilified, not only by the press or by the blogosphere, but also by the funding community. Recruitment, promotion is all now by index factor, by citation, and these sorts of things. It's also the global economic crisis, the rise of the Tea Party in America, the climate gate, the failure of Copenhagen, of course the rise of the BRIC countries, especially China. These have all kind of coalesced to cause this sense that we have to operate in this limited intellectual sphere.
Excellent. And then John, please.
Okay. I come from a discipline that over the last few years has become hideously diverse theoretically. That is to say, we've moved a long way in a lot of different directions, but the one area of the discipline that hasn't moved a great deal has probably been the study of international environmental politics, which has remained pretty much liberal institutionalist, dominated by rational choice theorists and so on and so forth, and that may or may not be a good thing. Now, the organising concept of my 3 minutes comes from an article written 20, 30 years ago by Robert Cox, which I'm sure you may be familiar with, where he made a distinction between problem solving and critical theory. And it seems to me that what we've done a lot of is problem solving. We've been discussing, very specific problem solving, and that's good and that's fine, and I go along with a lot of this. It's a useful contribution we can make. There was an editorial in The Guardian the other day saying the problem with IR was that it had become a stylized discipline that didn't address questions like voting in the United Nations. But I think there's also something to be said for the other side of this dichotomy, that is to say critical theory. And I sometimes reflect about what the role of academics are. Is our role, as it were, to sort of second-guess policymakers, because very often policymakers are way ahead of us, and we sort of catch up in our publications about 5 years later. No, I think there's a deeper sense in which we may influence things through a deeper critical analysis. And it strikes me that, rather than influencing policymakers very directly, a lot of policymakers are imprisoned intellectually by the scribblings of some long-dead academic that they read when they were 18 or 19. And that may well be part of our function to provide that. And in terms of the kind of list of questions that I think we could ask in a more critical way, obviously there are questions of power and how power is exercised in the system. On the wider political functions and consequences of the climate regime. And related to that, something I think is very important but needs kind of rather fundamental thinking, is the relationship between forms of security, that is energy security, climate security and national security, something which is exercising the EU at the moment. And I think, one of our functions as academics is to kind of give some clarity to that debate. Now, I know a lot of my colleagues these days would describe themselves as post-structuralists, and I know the structures they are referring to are not the kind of structures that Marxists used to discuss and so on and so forth. But I do think there is also a role for what I would call a deeper critical structural analysis in two ways. One is to look very obviously at the way in which the climate regime is embedded in a broader international system and the international structure. And it sometimes worries me in the sense that, the 20 years of the climate regime have been a period of absolutely epochal change in the international system, but it somehow fails to get reflected in a lot of our analyses. We're looking at rather more at a closed system. So there is that sense, and I think realism has something to say there. And finally, and I think this relates to what Chuks is saying, there are deeper and related structures in terms of the way the global political economy works, and we need to take those into account, particularly in understanding the positions of less developing countries, and those less developed countries that have hardly been mentioned. We've talked a lot about the basics, but there is 100 or so more members of the UNFCCC who rarely get mentioned, who are very often in a very structurally disadvantaged position in the global economy. And that, I think, is probably my 3 minutes, isn't it?
Thanks very much. Let's give the four panelists an applause. Then let me ask the first question then. I mean, I hear you talk about climate governance as if it is this one elephant that Steve was talking about. And Steve also said, how do you eat an elephant bit by bit? I mean, surely governance of technology innovation is very different from governance of finance, from governance of mitigation, from governance of forests, from governance of adaptation. Does it make sense to separate those and to actually have separate, perhaps you would say fragmented, research looking into those sub-governance or governance of sub-elements of climate change? Or do we need this all-encompassing grand plan that Chuck was referring to? And then, of course, in addition to all the elements that I mentioned, there is development, there is trade, there are all these other issues that you can hang on the Christmas tree. What are your views about, what is pragmatic and what would be desirable in terms of doing governance research on climate change? Is anyone volunteering to answer that question?
I can start. I think it's an excellent question, and one that sort of was thinking about over the course of the day. But I often come back to, there's a quote in Mike Hume's book, the 2009 book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, which I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially says, we need to stop thinking about climate change as a problem and rather recognize that this is a condition of modern life. And so that fundamentally changes the governance challenge. So rather than trying to think about climate change as a problem or a set of different problems, we need to ask the question, how does one govern in this context of, and here probably find myself moving towards Frank and thinking, in this if we call it the Anthropocene, whatever, there's a changing condition of the world around us that means we need to govern differently, trade, development, sort of everything we do within that context. And I haven't really thought through exactly what that means, but that's just sort of gives me a framework to start thinking about that question.
Right. Should I take a shot at it?
Go ahead.
Well, I think I like this analogy very much about how one eats an elephant and bit by bit. And I think the issue is, of course, on the one hand, we can't have these silos of, that there are different aspects to the climate problem and they perhaps pose slightly different governance challenges and the approaches, solutions will be different. But I think what could be useful as a governance scholar is to look at certain concepts that are becoming important in research and seeing how they apply differentially to these areas. So for example, there's been a lot of discussion about fragmentation, fragmented architectures, and there we can see that that's the case with mitigation, with adaptation, so you can sort of map the fragmented architectures. In climate finance, you can do the same for REDD. And then the question becomes, well, you can ask all of the questions around fragmentation to these different issue areas, and through that develop an understanding perhaps of how they might be similar or different. So that could be one approach. Or you have the accountability and transparency issue that I mentioned. And that, I think, what's fascinating about the climate realm is that you can take any conceptual concern you have and apply it to the climate arena, so you can look at accountability relations across these different aspects of the climate problem, whether that's what's happening in the UNFCCC around mitigation or adaptation, etc. And I will still wait to elaborate on the accountability issue, and let's address that.
That's a hint to the audience. Make sure you ask a question that Artie can respond. Very, very quickly. You talked about grand plans. I mean, is there a conflict between focused research and on, say, the governance of forests and the bigger plan that you were looking for?
My blunt and short answer is no. I do not see at intellectual level any reason to make any distinction between mitigation and adaptation. Whether you are asking questions about legitimacy, accountability, about equity, about allocation, they are the same source of challenges that also crop up when you are looking at adaptation. Granted, there are different dynamics in terms of scale, but those questions inevitably crop up. Whether you are looking at the global scale, at the regional scale, or at the micro scale.
Okay, let's leave it at that for the moment, because I think we would like to engage the audience, as well as the virtual audience. Those who are following this on the webcast, you can tweet or email any questions if you have them. Any comments, responses, ideas from the audience? Robin, please.
Thanks. I have a question for Artie. Could you tell us about the role of accountability in scholarship in this field?
Thank you, Robin. Well, I think what I was so I've been working on, basically on these notions of accountability and particularly transparency. And I find that at least my point of departure was that transparency is one of the most overused but possibly most underanalyzed concepts, at least in our field, in global environmental governance. There's a flourishing transparency research going on in other domains like security, diplomacy, etc. And why I say it's becoming more center stage in climate governance is because it's so intertwined with basically, I mean, this old idea. Accountability is normally seen to empower the weak, to sort of hold the powerful to account. That's the understanding of accountability. But this sort of feel-good democratizing imperative accountability is being supplemented in, say, the UNFCCC context with a more neoliberal marketizing imperative for accountability. The idea is in order to be able to document performance, to compare performance, in order to compensate performance, you need accountability, and accountability is becoming more multidirectional. And it's being manifested through MRV systems, which are often characterized as, well, that's the technical side. Or Sebastian talked about infrastructures where MRV systems and transparency was the first bullet. But I would suggest that these are not, these are not managerial sort of, let's just measure in order to compensate. There are severe political questions involved with MRV, such as what gets measured by whom and how. And so one needs a critical analysis of accountability, transparency, as manifested through MRV regimes, which I think is not yet taking place to the extent that it could in mainstream climate governance research. There are STS perspectives, etc., but it's not really mainstreamed, and that's what we are trying to do in our research.
Thanks very much. Does that answer the question, Robin? Very good. We're all waiting for the drinks, I think. Well, in that case, let me ask a question. Perhaps also following up on the issue of transparency and accountability. I think it was 2011 when Transparency International had a global corruption report dedicated to climate change and climate governance. And it had some examples of poor governance, and I guess I used the word corruption in a few instances. And the most concrete example actually had to do with RED plus. Yet at the same time, RED is often seen as one of the examples, one of the ways in which governance can work, that is driven, inspired by UNFCCC, yet at the same time also has a strong bottom-up component. How many of you would like to comment on RED? I know Artie would love to. But Chucks, what more broadly?
What I would like to do is to use your reference to RED and to forest in general to actually, and I think it has been already said here this morning, to recognize and enjoin us to widely recognize a bit more what developing countries have been doing. One of the areas where you had the best examples of progress within the global climate change context is the work that Brazil has done in combating deforestation. And yet I get people to hear people say, well, it's all about BRICS. BRICS are not pulling their weight. But actually, there's a lot of effort at the BRICS level and developing countries more generally to engage in climate governance. And I think that Catherine makes the point absolutely clearly this morning that the problem is loads and loads of failed promises by the developed countries to meet up with their own ambition target, but also the disbursement of finance to developing countries.
Okay, Artie, go ahead.
Okay. Well, very briefly then. No, I think it's interesting that when one talks about transparency and accountability, often you think about, well, corruption and shining a light on something. So there's this Justice Brandeis quote about transparency, which is sunlight is the best disinfectant. But I think if one thinks about RED Plus, then one manifestation of the transparency turn in this is again MRV systems. And I think MRV systems in climate governance are becoming just, they'll require these complex infrastructures of transparency, which I think need attention. So if you look at MRV for RED Plus, then it's really about what is measured is actually what gets governed. So you're sort of constituting what is to be governed by what is measured, and what is not measurable or what is not measured is then not visible and therefore not taken into account. So non-carbon benefits, multiple benefits, etc. So in that sense, I would say transparency and how it manifests in RED Plus is very important to look at. There are all kinds of other issues around RED Plus governance, which...
But what's the role of research? We're talking about scholarship here. Michelle.
Well, so, one thing that I struggle with, particularly in light of some of John's discussions, is the role of the researcher. And, one of the problems, particularly in working in the climate area, is there's so much happening in real time, right? And I think there's often a tension between, do we want to speak to the debates that are going on in the climate regime, in order to have something to, provide input for 2015, and that requires one set of asking particular types of questions and doing research and interacting with decision makers, or taking the time to step back and sort of question those things. But that then, sort of creates a distance between us and decision makers who say, yes, I understand there may be all kinds of problems with MRV and these deeper philosophical questions, but tomorrow I have to go into a meeting and sort of decide what we're going to measure and how we're going to measure it. And so I think, and I mean, particularly in the UK system, where a lot of the way, sort of departments are being evaluated has to do with this impact, which is very much more based on sort of, did they do something in the negotiations, then, did you change the way sort of a decision maker is reflecting on the problem? So I feel like there's these sort of tensions that we have to operate within and raise questions about the role of the researcher.
Just very quickly, I don't want to, it's far too painful, the whole question of impact, but those people in Britain will know. I know it's obviously, I mean, the system is very poorly designed and so on and so forth. What I would say from some experience with the ESRC some time ago, the Research Funding Council, was that this business of being policy relevant is quite dangerous, because the whole system tends to be biased towards economists, because when they run research proposals around departments, people from the Treasury will say, "Oh yeah, that's just the sort of economic modelling we want," and so on and so forth. So it's very short term, and it tends to stack up against term, I would say, deeper and critical research. You tend to lose out. I think we lose out also in political science and international relations, because methodologically we're so weak. I mean, if you stack up our research against those from economists and so forth, you may think the methods, you may think it's a lot of nonsense, but it's a lot of extremely well specified nonsense, and we fail very much at that level as well. So there is a problem with the policy requirement, but there's also a problem, I think, in terms of having a proposal that where the methods section says, I will do some deep interviews, etc., and put it all together, and it's not really adequate. So I think there is an ongoing problem. There's also another ongoing problem, which these things recur with the interface with natural scientists. I mean, 20 years ago or more, British research councils were putting money on the table for people to come up with research projects that would bridge the research councils, and we never really, I remember, got very, very good proposals for this, and I think it's still an ongoing problem. So there are massive problems there related to the funding of research, and I think there are real arguments for allowing people to follow their bent, and you will get long-term benefits from that, which you maybe won't get from doing very, very short-term research. We accept this in the natural sciences, but we don't tend to accept it so much, I think, in the social sciences.
Eva, you wanted to give a solution to all this.
Rather, I have a question. I hope the panelists can help me to think about that. So I was struck by the comments by John and Chucks on sort of the intellectual impoverishment of our field, or the analytical constraints, or our lack of political imagination and so on. And I guess the question that I would like, or the issue that I would like you to develop further is, so how can we as social scientists carve out the space for critical research, especially in a time when we're constantly evaluated on the basis of narrow age citation indices, or when we are asked to adjust our research agendas to problem framings defined by natural scientists in initiatives such as Future Earth. So how do we go about sort of developing this space for innovative and critical research?
That sounds like a good question for all four of you, I think.
Indeed. But my answer is I don't know. I don't know. Because all the pressures, all the triggers, all the incentive structures, a number of which you have already mentioned, funding, citation index, all of these things are putting pressures on people to do the so-called problem-solving, policy-oriented research. And if you don't change the incentive structure, I see no way of escaping this trap. I mean, I lived through some volume of ISQ, International Studies Quarterly, and also some of the GEP, on which I sit on the editorial board. And what you see, alarmingly I would say, is increase in manufacturing of statistical approaches and numbers. And so, for example, in trying to decide whether a particular country has had effect on climate governance, I read a paper that tracked the number of delegations and plotted a graph on where they've been, who they have met, both in coffee shops and in teas and those sorts of things, and then came up with some numbers. I think those numbers mean absolutely nothing when you're trying to do a deep, qualitative research about the influence of a particular country or individual in negotiation. But there is an increasing pressure for quantification, for statistics or numbers to be plugged into the way that we do things. The answer is, I don't know. We need to change the incentive structure, and that's where I will call on the likes of Frank Bierman and Richard and other people that have gone ahead of us. They need to have this debate on where it matters, so that we are not just trapped in this kind of door, but space is created for deeper reflection and critical thinking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Artie, try and keep it brief.
I think I can keep it brief because this is, of course, a very fundamental challenge we all face. And I think it's a three-dimensional one, maybe, but there's the speed issue. So you have to produce under time constraints on issues which are evolving as you're trying to understand them. And it has to be policy relevant, and it has to be publishable in a scientific journal at the same time. And you also have to be interdisciplinary while you're doing it. So, I mean, this complex of challenges, of course, compromises any possibility to sit and actually think about what you might, or read or reflect, and all of those good things why we might have entered academia in the first place. So, yes, this is a challenge.
Okay, Michelle?
So I've been spending the last few months in Europe, and I was telling Artie that it's had me realize that I have a better situation than I had realized. I've often been jealous of the sort of funding opportunities that the Europeans had. I felt like everybody had these big projects that were funded by the Europeans or the Swedish government, and I thought, that's great. We don't have, one of the challenges in the US is the lack of social science funding. But the model is that 40% of my salary is dedicated to my research time. So in some ways, I don't have the same pressures of having to constantly get the grants, which then creates incentives to be doing more policy relevant research. So I realize that in some ways that gives me a privileged position to be able to sit back and do a little bit more of the reflective reading. So maybe the answer is having less research funding. I don't know. I don't think that's the message we want to send. But.
I mean, I think it's a responsibility on the gatekeepers, both of journals and of funding agencies, to take this on board. And there's real responsibility there. And the other thing I would say, referencing Frank, is that I think people will still sit on Chesterfields or deck chairs or whatever and read books and think. They may not smoke cigars anymore, but I think people are still going to do it whatever. So I'm a bit more optimistic.
Mm-hmm. We're reaching the end of this session. I see maybe one or two urgent questions. If we can keep the questions really short as well as the answers. What I think is interesting, I probably won't be given time by Karen to do a wrap-up and a summary, so I'll do it now. I thought we were going to have a conversation about what are going to be the issues to talk about in research. And interestingly, we've moved more into how can we actually do that research. I don't think that's necessarily a failure of this particular panel. Of course, both are going to be interesting. But I'm going to entertain one more question. I'm going to ask each of you to respond to that question, as well as to the question, having focused more on the how, and what stands in the way of doing good governance research. Also think, have we been researching the right kind of things? Is the focus of our research still okay, and is that something to be continued, or is what we research in the future, does that need to change? Last question, please.
Ronnie Lipschitz, UC Santa Cruz. I actually wanted to make an intervention, but you can treat this as a question. That listening to all of this, I'm reminded that our research institutions are set up to reproduce the status quo, or at least to legitimate and justify what the status quo is. Now here, we're trying to address these large-scale problems with the tools that are basically about reproducing the status quo. And this sort of, this concept which came up a lot about transformation, right, about radical changes. How does that come about? Frank cited Robert Cox. I want to go back farther and cite Marx, who said something like, the job of the philosopher is not to study society, it's to change it. And I think, Cox always comes up, but I think Marx was more on point. So it's not really a question, but I suppose you can respond to it.
You each have like 30 seconds to reflect on that and the role of ideology in research, as well as in the question that I just asked. Are we researching the right things, or do we change?
I can only add, I'd add Gramsci as well, probably, to that. But I obviously going to say we're not, because although I do recognise the importance of more problem-oriented research, I have a number of questions that really we do need to look at, and which are particularly structural questions. So I would say not. Look at some of the bigger structural issues.
Okay.
Agreed. I mean, I don't really have anything else to say. I think these are tough questions, and I don't know. I guess what I would say is I'm not sure there are the right questions to be asking. I mean, I think what's come out here is that there are so many different questions to be asking, and we need to sort of, recognize that, there's different ways to do different types of research, and it all has a place, and it needs to be valued. And as you said, sort of the gatekeepers need to recognize the value of diversity. So maybe that's what I would say.
Thanks.
I think I would second what Michelle just said, that I don't think we can say that, well, we asked, whether they're the right or wrong questions, but I would just make the point that in terms of this dichotomy about how we do research and what we are researching, I think, of course, those are linked as well. So the changing nature of the way we do research is also influencing what we choose to focus on, and that could be, there could be negative implications of that. And I think over yesterday and today, there's been this call for more critical perspectives on the various issues that were presented, and this focus on power, equity, etc. So there is a move towards, there is that call for transformational research. But of course, the fact that we still have to keep saying that even today, that we need to think about equity and it's the missing elephant in the room, etc., suggests that, of course, it's not happening.
Well, in a sense, this is where I started from, that whilst problem-solving positivist approaches and questions are not generally irrelevant, we need to be challenging more of the orthodoxy and be escaping from these narrow confines of neoliberal worldview and be questioning fundamental structures. I want to just emphasize again what John said. within the gatekeeping journals, we need also to be emphasizing a little bit more robust methodology. We can't do exactly what they're doing in statistics, but there is room for a lot of improvement in our methodological approaches. And maybe, Frank, what you can help us to do is create, I mean, there was an attempt from Oxford mostly to do this through the Nature Climate Change, but we need an equivalence of Nature, a science journal that is dedicated to social sciences with a very, very high index factor. Okay? So if I publish there and some other person publishes in science, then we get well measured. Not when I publish in the best journal in our field, maybe ISQ or JEP, and somebody else publishes in ecological economics. When you rank that person's citation index or H index or impact factor, I have no chance, whether it's in promotion or in getting funding.
Okay. Thanks very much for your thoughts and insights, and thanks also to the audience for some very great questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I think it's been a very important and critical conversation on the how and the what's of climate governance scholarship. We are now moving to a close of the symposium, sadly. But we have one more important intervention here by Linné, and he will make some jubilee reflections. He's very well positioned to do this since he's one of the founders of the center and a former director.
I think you were selling what I'm going to say now because I was just wrapping things up, but thank you anyway. Well, you know, when you turn 40 or 50 or whatever, when you have an anniversary, some of us at least try to gather our old friends, schoolmates, and loves from past. And I think that's what we've done today, both from abroad and from Sweden. Many of you were a great inspiration for us already when we started the center. We quoted your work. I went back to check the first applications that we wrote and so on. And I found several of you I quoted in that. And throughout these 10 years, you've been a great inspiration for us. And so that's great. And today, I think you have made sure, and through your academic work, that you still continue to produce and that you promoted the various books and papers that are coming out. You will continue to be a great inspiration for us in the, to quote Frank, the 50 years to come. But I'm very grateful for the discussion that we had here and to point out the directions. When we started the center, we thought it would be a node to bring different perspectives together. The center, maybe that hasn't come across today so much, is a joint venture between the Meteorological and Hydrological Institute and the university. So it's intended to be interdisciplinary. We have the social scientists and the humanities, but also natural scientists involved in the center. And we wanted to bring together perspectives from research and perspectives from policy and practitioners into the research. And we would like to we wanted to have different academic perspectives crash and collide in the discussions, and preferably different policy positions, because in that clash of perspectives, in the dialogues, when we challenge each other, that's when we can improve our analysis. So I'm quite grateful that we, at least towards the end of this day, had some of these different perspectives really come across, because I think that is very fruitful, and I appreciate the plurality that and the openness to allow for several perspectives and see the value to allow that. Like several of you pointed out, and regretted that Roger could not be here, for instance. So thanks for that. It's John Lewis Gaddis, the one of my inspirational historians. He's written a lot about Cold War history. I think one of his quotes is that historical consciousness as maturity itself leaves us with a sense of our own significance as well as our insignificant as well as our significance. And I think that is kind of interesting when I thought about this jubilee and what happened in the research community, the climate research field in 10 years. It's good with anniversaries in your life to think back, what has shaped me, what has changed, why have I come to where I am? And the same in research. When I think back about 10 years, it's easy to think that not much have changed. I mean, many of the issues that we brought up as important for the future, they were raised 10 years ago, but maybe not as much, and evidently framed in other ways than we do today. So I think it's kind of interesting to think about how will we look back in the next 10 years when we think back to when we discussed the 2015 treaty, and how we approach that in research in 10 years. So I welcome you back in 10 years to discuss that. Thanks very much. I would like to thank today's presenter. So if you could, and discussant, so if you could come up, that would be lovely. Here? To me? Anybody, did any participate today? Yes, there are very few. Ska du dela ut dem? Ni kan väl dela ut dem då? Kan inte ni dela ut dem, du och... Du får komma in här. Ulrika, en discussant. Ska ni säga någonting?
Okay, we are coming to the end, and we want to thank all our keynote speaker and roundtable participants for their excellent interventions with a little present. And again, we hope that the conversation on climate change scholarship and practice will continue. And I go on what you said. See you again here in 10 years. Right here. Thank you.
But that was just the beginning of the end, because there are, of course, 3 persons that have been fantastic and instrumental, and without whose fantastic job this couldn't have come about. And that is, of course, Karin, Eva, and Ingrid here, who has done a fabulous job. So they get chocolate and you get flowers. And the audience get drinks. No, okay.
Is this working? Yes. So for those of you who haven't noted in the program, there will be drinks in the restaurant, so we can celebrate before you leave Norrköping today. So welcome to our little mingle downstairs. And of course, we also want to thank Björn-Ola. You didn't get a chocolate. Now you will. So welcome to the first floor. And thanks for a great day.